Andrew Berea and the Cleveland Browns have done a tremendous job through free agency and trades up until this point. One position of room looks to still be a big question mark. The running back room. What is the state of the Cleveland Browns running back room behind Nick Chubb? We'll get to all that and more on your latest Locked On Browns.
You are Locked On Browns, your daily Cleveland Browns podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network. Your team every day.
Welcome back, my friends, to the
You are Locked On Browns, your daily Cleveland Browns podcast.
The Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. Your host, Jeff Lloyd, at Jeff_LJ_Lloyd. G. Bush out today, feeling a little bit under the weather. Could be maybe more than a day. But joining us here from Sports Illustrated Browns Digest, Pete Smith along for the ride here, as we are going to get to some things today relevant to the Cleveland Browns running back room. First things first, we're going to go through later Mock Draft Monday. Pete and I are going to highlight some running backs that will have some abilities here for the Cleveland Browns. We're going to go through and possibly talk about the possibility of what can happen for the Browns if there is a possibility of a veteran free agent on there and available that could fit the Browns' needs. But first, we'll kick it off where the room is currently. Nick Chubb, obviously, Nick Chubb now going into year 6 of his tenure here with the Cleveland Browns, everything up until this point. Nick Chubb has been everything as advertised as being a focal contributor to this team on and off the field. The standard of how the Cleveland Browns want their players to conduct themselves. Looking at the rest of the room, you've got Jerome Felton. You've got Dimitri Felton. You've got Jerome Ford. John Kelly still in the fold. Nate McRae in the fold as well here. But Pete, for a roster in a lot of positions where a lot of clarity has been given over the last couple of weeks by Andrew Berea and his staff, this is one definitely room now where you lose from last year, Dearness Johnson. You lose from last year, Kareem Hunt. Obviously, that was, I think others feel maybe that was dead money essentially because you certainly weren't getting the return, and never a wise football move to be paying and not getting the return to said investment. But Pete, this room needs work. And there's several ways to do it here, but as it looks today, and to want to limit the amount of workload you give Nick Chubb, I'm not sure you have the guys basically in that room to do it.
Right. I mean, Jerome Ford had 8 carries last year, and I like Jerome Ford, but you're not going to go in with a mindset of, I hope this works out if Nick Chubb needs a breather. None of the other guys have really done anything. Dimitri Felton is seemingly positioning himself more to be one of the 34 wideouts on this roster as opposed
to compete for wide receiver 6 or 7. By all means, good luck with that.
And you've got the former Saginaw Valley State back in Nate McRae. I mean, interesting, worth bringing to camp, I suppose, but they need to build up this room. And, it looks like they have deliberately set it up to do it this way, that they have these holes, and we're less than a month from the draft.
And to look at it, and you understand that the percentage and basically, the amount of commitment to running the football here is probably going to dwindle down here. And you're going to start to focus a little bit more on Deshaun Watson, his abilities, things he can do, and things you expect him to do. But with all that being said, Nick can still be an asset here for a team that's going to focus a little bit more on throwing the ball. Number one, there is going to be the element of surprise where it's not going to be 1st and 10 and, hey, here's a good shot. You're going to get Nick Chubb 3 times in a row. But look, going back early in his career, I mean, the wheel route touchdown at Cincinnati, always something that was impressive. There was the touchdown reception, the screen against the Pittsburgh Steelers. There have been times, there have certainly been instances where we've seen Nick Chubb and his ability. And I think there are times where we thought maybe we were going to really see Nick become a little bit more focal point of the passing game, whatever, dictated that it didn't necessarily work out that way. He's not a guy that basically you can say, well, if we're going to start throwing the ball more, then, there's no sense in having a guy like Nick Chubb on the field.
Well, look, I mean, we got a preview of what this is going to look like in the finale against the Pittsburgh Steelers. Nick Chubb in that game ran the ball 12 times for 77 yards. That's 6.4 yards per carry. Nobody's going to be upset about that. And then you supplement that by making him part of the passing game. He caught 5 passes for 45 yards, including that touchdown was that broken play improvised where he and Watson had pretty good chemistry there. He catches the ball in the end zone. And what do you end up with? 122 yards on the day on 17 touches, 7.5 yards per touch. That's pretty ideal for what you want to have. It's less workload because he's not getting as many carries behind line of scrimmage. And he's getting the ball, theoretically behind several of the defenders on the defense, but he's still a playmaker. He's not the most natural pass catcher ever. He's not Alvin Kamara type, but he's a problem. And with the amount of speed that this team has added that can threaten down the field, it should create more space for a guy like Chubb to get out and make some easy plays. So even though you're sort of shifting on the dial how many runs you might be using in this offense, it doesn't mean you have to necessarily use less Nick Chubb to do it.
And, to your point, and what I do agree with is, look, it's going to be less wear and tear on Nick if you're most of the time getting tackled by defensive backs as opposed to getting tackled by 300-pound defensive linemen or by linebackers. The touchdown reception against Pittsburgh, basically you had one guy in limbo. It's, I have to give my responsibility to Sean Watson. He's going to run. And Nick, just with the wherewithal and the intelligence of, the more I basically widen this area where this guy is essentially trying to either take away Deshaun's legs or cover me. You basically put, the linebacker in a choice where he had to make a decision. So that shows, Nick's, aptitude and intelligence to be a part of this. And once Nick got to a certain part, basically outside of the numbers, the linebacker was screwed. So he basically committed to Watson. With that, Watson just basically fired, a pitch and catch, which is like a father tossing a ball to his young son. Simple, easy. But Nick can be a part of this. He can factor more into this, for all he is with the delusions of grandeur, and you would love for Nick to win a rushing title. Look, I don't care about that stuff anymore. I want to play long, meaningful, successful football in January. So however they go about doing it, which Nick can totally be a part of, that's something to totally consider here and factor in.
Yeah, what is his priority? Is it winning a Super Bowl or is it winning a rushing title?
He's already getting paid, so at this point, what does that stuff matter?
He wants to win, and that's the best way for that to happen. And again, 17 touches in that game, 5 of them receptions. That lends itself to him being available in January, February, the time you want him most. Like, we don't want to go through another year where people are sitting here arguing every week about not enough carries for this guy. And then if you do find your way into the playoffs, he's got nothing left because you had to run him to death to get there. This is the best way to do it. This is the best way to utilize Deshaun Watson, and him being able to go out and even just a check down, somebody's got to account for him, which is one less guy that accounts for Watson, which potentially creates more space for him.
Yeah, I mean, you don't want to get in a scenario, if you remember a couple of years ago, Derrick Henry was out for weeks, came back, Tennessee Titans, Dante Hightower, I believe, was a running back, was having a great game. They kept trying to force Derrick Henry into this game, even though he was 70%. They're losing the game. And you probably could have won the game if you just played the hot hand that day. And, these are things you have to get worried about. And things you start to think about as Nick Chubb, starts to reach, the mature part of his career. And whether anybody wants to believe it or not, we sometime, somewhere soon, the thought of, what will life be after Nick Chubb is something you have to consider. Look, we're not saying it's necessarily this year, and we hope it's not next year, but you're foolish to not start looking to the future and what is best for your team. We're going to switch it up here. Look, the Browns have 2 ways to go here. You can either go the free agent route or you can go the draft. You can do a little bit of both, but we're going to go the free agent route here next. Jeff Lloyd joined by Pete Smith, your latest Locked On Browns. Today's episode is brought to you by Ultimate Football GM. You've heard me talk about this mobile game app, and if you've never thought you'd make a good GM, well, maybe you should try it and see whether or not you are capable of it. It's not as easy as you think to create a dynasty. When you play Ultimate Football GM, you get to control and manage every strategic aspect of your team as you play through seasons and lead your team to glory, trying to build an historic dynasty. Look, you get faced with several scenarios in this. Personnel issues where guys may misbehaving off the field and you've got to satisfy your owner. You've got to handle the draft. You have to handle contract extensions, players getting older, players you have to move on for, players that you need to re-sign, all of this stuff. Plus, you got to have the right coaches, the right coordinators. You got to manage all your finances, including the contracts, like I said, navigating your franchise through free agency, the draft, injuries, player personnel issues, and all the ups and downs of a season. All of this in a challenging, realistic game world. Ultimate Football GM is completely free and playable offline. Play on the go as you want and when you want to. Locked On Browns listeners get a 100% free boost to their franchise when using the promo code Locked On, all caps, no space, in the game store. That's Locked On in all caps. So make sure to check it out today. To download the game, just visit ultimate-gm.com or look it up in the app stores. That's ultimate-gm.com. Ultimate Football GM. Start your dynasty today. Now, Pete, and I think this is going to be the case probably for the foreseeable future in the NFL. Great running backs, that will not make it to free agency. The ones that get to free agency are the ones that are maybe pushed out or are going to be the ones, Ezekiel Elliott, where they're just not satisfying their team as far as the salary they're being paid. You always, maybe you're looking for blue chippers, and it always seems that teams that make the best running back acquisitions are the teams that usually do it in season. The Bills obviously was a trade last year. Naheem Hyde was a big move for them, obviously bolstered their receiving threat out of the backfield, gave them a boost in the return game. But Pete, names out there, like there's some guys that could maybe fit necessarily, but a lot of it comes down to money. A lot of it for these guys, maybe you're waiting to see the way the draft shakes out because I'm going to commit now. But if they can get a guy who's going to be, $1 million cheaper, even more, then I could end up in a situation where I'm not getting pushed to make this team. Maybe I'm getting pushed to show off to get moved on from. It's a really tricky slope as far as managing the free agent market when it comes to running backs in the NFL.
Well, I think at this point, the leverage for running backs is to wait until after the draft. I imagine every team is basically saying, here's what we're willing to offer. In some of these cases, probably the league minimum. Like I assume Kareem Hunt is probably being offered the league minimum. Maybe there's some incentive attached. But that's because all these teams can theoretically go in the draft and grab a guy or multiple guys. Whereas after the draft, if they didn't get those guys, maybe there's a little bit more money. Maybe you keep that flexibility to command a little bit of extra. But he's a popular choice, obviously, with the history he has, but and he can do certain things. Last year, he looked very slow, to me anyway. And I do have questions about the direction of the offense and how he fits in it. He's not a guy who has great vision. He's a guy who thrives on gap runs where you have a predetermined hole, go there. But the Browns, not only do they run outside zone with the move to Deshaun Watson, they're going to run a whole lot more inside zone too. I don't think that either of those are good for him. It doesn't mean they won't run gap stuff. It doesn't mean they won't run trap and counter and those type of things. It just may not be enough to justify it. Jet McKinnon, meanwhile, stylistically is probably the best fit because he's got a lot of receiving ability, which certainly fits with the direction the Browns are going. But again, I think after the draft is where his market is going to be at its best, whether he just does another year with the Chiefs or he goes somewhere else. But right now I expect their markets are practically nothing more than the league minimum. Maybe there's a little extra.
And the thing with Jet McKinnon is and he brought a really nice red zone element to the Chiefs passing game last year. They kind of used to run this staggered motion, where he would kind of just delay behind the offensive line and basically just put himself in a spot where it was, him and one-on-one versus a linebacker. He'd take 2 steps towards a linebacker or he'd hide and then maybe trickle out between like the tackle tight end hole. And there was just no way. I mean, there's not many linebackers in the NFL who have the speed to even compete with that. Led to a lot of easy red zone touchdowns for the Chiefs. But Pete, how crazy is this that, I'd say right now, I believe that maybe there might be a hotter market for Dontrell Hilliard, former Browns running back, than there probably is for a guy like Kareem Hunt. Here's a guy, in Tennessee when he first went down there, never really thought much of it. But every time they called his number, and he did some good things here, but if you're a Browns fan, I'd personally be more interested in bringing back a guy like Dontrell Hilliard. We've seen the best of Kareem Hunt, and now we've probably seen, the lowest part of Kareem Hunt. But if you're going to sign somebody and it could be dirt cheap, I think a guy like Dontrell Hilliard probably brings his team a hell of a lot more appeal than somebody like Kareem Hunt does.
Yeah, and frankly, I think that's the benefit for him is waiting, is because he's probably the most attractive of those backs because he's so much younger, has shown juice, even if it's in a limited role. But that's where we're at in the process. I don't, how many teams are looking for their starting running back right now, as opposed to just a guy to come in and give you a little bit of extra. And maybe that's Dontrell Hilliard's perfect for the Browns in that scenario. But here again, wait till after the draft, see if you need it. And if you don't like what you see immediately from those rookies, give him a call and see if he can help you out. Because he's been good here. He was Dearness Johnson before Dearness Johnson was here, and he's obviously got a big speed component in his game, and may have developed a little bit of as a receiver.
I mean, and I go through this list of names left. I mean, J.D. McKissick is another guy that might fit for that type of what you're looking for if you're taking, Nick off the field. Of course, Jet McKinnon is probably the top one there, but you get to this list. I mean, guys like Royce Freeman, Latavius Murray, David Johnson, for God's sakes. David Johnson's only 31 years old. It feels like he's probably closer to 41 years old. One other sneaky name, maybe Marlon Mack. Here was a guy that had a lot of success for the Colts, still only 27 years old. Of course, maybe the knees and the ankles probably closer to my age than a traditional 27-year-old. But again, this is a type of guy here, dirt minimum, vet minimum. You bring him in and say, look, we're still bringing in kids through the draft. If it all goes well for you, because Marlon Mack, the issue's never necessarily been his play. It's been his availability.
Sure, but I think that's probably something the Browns are going to have to factor in with this, because they can't have a situation where Chubb, has something go wrong where he misses a game or few, and then they're relying on somebody who with instability. I think at that point, somebody like Marlon Mack might be more of a third option, which I'm fine with. But again, the draft, given the talent in the draft, I think you're more likely to find that. And maybe that's the scenario. Let's say you draft a guy you really like. You're looking towards the future and you're saying this guy can help Nick Chubb now, and he can maybe help the Browns when Nick Chubb is gone. But you're like, I just want that little bit of insurance in a veteran. I want a little bit of a guy who I know has done it before. And then you bring in Marlon Mack to be that third option to sort of finish out the room.
And the thing with that, and you go back to and this is things the Browns can't afford to do anymore. You can't afford to drop $9 million on Kareem Hunt and Dearness Johnson with the fingers crossed theory of, I pray we don't ever have to play them. Like, you can't do that anymore. Money has become a real, and I don't want to say issue. It's become a real presence within the Browns locker room, and it's enabled them to do what they are currently doing. And as you and I have talked about for years, Pete, you want to be able to maintain this course every year. You want to be able to go out and, spruce things up and bring guys in. And you just don't necessarily have the luxury to say, well, here's $9 million for two running backs that we pray necessarily take a snap.
Right. And off the top of your head, do you know who the leading rusher for Deshaun Watson's career in the NFL is?
Oh, God.
Our old buddy, Carlos Hyde.
There we go.
Like his rejuvenated, changed his diet season. He barely cracked 1,000 yards. Like, no one knows better how important it is to make sure you're not in a situation where you don't have a running back than Deshaun Watson, because his best season, they had nothing. they had absolutely nothing to run the ball with. And what happened? They couldn't close out games. They struggled to sort of keep teams off balance, and it just kept biting them over and over. And there were obviously other issues with that team. Their defense wasn't very good, but that team went 3-13-1. Like, they want to make sure they have that balance, and Deshaun Watson's no fool in that. So that's the thing, is like, you have to look at running back. You're sitting there thinking, well, the receivers are so important, and they are, and you've got tight ends and but for this offense, running back is now a weapon in the same way that wide receiver is a weapon. Guys who can catch passes, guys who can take advantage of the space you're creating by everything else you're doing. They have this great offensive line. Kevin Stefanski's a very, very good offensive coordinator when it comes to designing the run. They're not just going to be like, I guess we're done running the ball now. They're going to make sure it happens. So they have to have the horses in the stable to make sure they can do it.
Without question. And it's going to be fun here because, I think it's going to be a young route here that they're going to go. And that's here for segment 3 here. We'll continue, last couple of weeks, we did just straight mock drafts. For a lot of you guys, maybe the appeal of mock drafts this year with the Browns holding first to pick 74 might not be there. So Pete and I are both going to give you a couple of names running back wise that we think can help the Browns here to fill this room, get the room a little younger, and some guys, if the number's called and the opportunities there, can go ahead and contribute the way the Browns would need. Jeff Lloyd, Pete Smith, your latest Locked On Browns. For all your Browns coverage, Locked On Browns available on YouTube. Make sure you're subscribed, you got your notifications on, and of course, always available on your favorite podcast platform, available and free. Now, Pete, we've talked about this, and going, it is a good running back class. But the thing is, the value and the way NFL teams value the running back position, it's always head scratching. Bijan Robinson, fantastic prospect, but you got teams, you've got people saying top 10 player. You've got teams who, of guys that we trust who cover teams who think he could be a realistic option in the 20s. It's like all over the place. The one thing we can talk about with a guy like Bijan Robinson is he will not be available at pick 74. So we'll just punt on the talk of said young player. But Pete, a couple of running backs here, and I know you've spoken about this and you've written about this, but a couple of running backs here that you think can come in and, provide a little juice, even if you understand early on the plan is that most of it's going to be Nick Chubb and like, hey, kid, when we call your number, we need you to be ready.
Well, I think the beauty of what the Browns are doing and what this class has to offer is you can go multiple ways. If you're going to be able to play this consistent spread offense and make teams play wider and smaller, you can either take a speedy guy who can just eat up all that space and create plays with the ball in his hands, or you could take a bigger boy and just run over the little guys you have by spreading it out and just pound them. And both are good options. You're not going to get me to dislike one or the other. And this draft is sort of you're spoiled for choice. And so with that in mind, like one guy I absolutely love in a lot of the same ways I love Nick Chubb coming out. I believe I had that. Was Tank Bigsby or Cartavius Bigsby? I wish he would go by his given name. That's a great name to
That is a hell of a name. Absolutely.
Tank Bigsby can win with his speed. He can win with his agility. He makes SEC defenders look stupid routinely, and he can win with power. And you look at him and you look at the offense that Auburn had this past year, which was garbage, and 76% of his yards running the ball came after contact, which
he was the only option. He was the defense. He was the only guy you were worried about.
Absolutely. And he was their leading receiver with 30 receptions, which some of that, don't get me wrong, is some fly sweeps and those, the toss sweeps that sort of let you get the ball to your hand, to your guy as a quote unquote pass. It's really a handoff, but he's got decent hands and he's had the ability to somewhere to make some plays and do some different things, which I think is maybe a little bit different than Chubb, but it's certainly no worse at it. The biggest things Bigsby's got to deal with is he's a little loose with the ball and how he carries it, and he can get frustrated, understandably, given what he was dealing with, and try to force things that aren't there. But the schedule Auburn played, and I would say this across the board with Auburn prospects, was hellacious. They played all the big boys in the SEC, and they had to play Penn State, and they weren't very good. And yet this kid thrived. So he's got the size you want if you want to go that way. The other end, another SEC guy, if they want to go a true spread back, and I think this has to be super tempting for the Browns, is Devin Achane from Texas A&M, there's sort of three of these backs that really stand out in this class or in this style. One is Jahmyr Gibbs. There's almost no chance he's going to be available where the Browns are at, but he's sort of more of a receiver than even a running back, really. And then the other is Keaton Mitchell, who plenty of Browns fans love, out of East Carolina. The difference here is, Gibbs is 199 pounds, I think. Achane is like 189 pounds or somewhere in that. And then Keaton Mitchell is 179 pounds. You get, small, medium, large drinks on these guys. But Achane is a guy who's not afraid to run between the tackles. And with the Browns line, he's potentially going to be in position to just capitalize on a ton of space. And he's a guy who can go out in the backfield and run real routes, catch passes, and terrorize guys out in space. So with that in mind, you can have him run like a drag route, see who comes, he runs across the formation, see who picks him up. And somebody else is probably going to be open as a result with all the speed you added, with Elijah Moore, with Amari Cooper, with Donovan Peoples-Jones. You have all these options. David Njoku. They have to somehow find a way to cover all these guys. So a guy like Devin Achane, with the way the Browns want to attack opponents, could be super attractive in that mold. Personally, I'd love to get one of each, but unrealistic unless the Browns go super nuts and the board falls crazily that they get both of those guys in the third round. But I'm here for it.
No, but look, I mean, if you're telling me, and you think the Browns will keep 4 running backs, so you're telling me if it's Chubb and it's Jerome Ford, then there's a possibility, that 2 of these guys can make it. I don't think it's as far-fetched as people possibly, think it to be. For me, Kenny McIntosh, I just like, the arc at Georgia, that you go to a school like that, most likely going to have to, pay your dues and your patience. And he did that. The fact that he can kind of do a little bit of everything, because now it's rare that you get guys like Nick Chubb that are so good and are so polished and so successful in what they do that you don't necessarily force them into having to do more. A guy like McIntosh can contribute in all facets as far as a running back. And, I'm not going to get off, and I know you like the player too. And for me and you, it stinks because it's just an absolute mystery right now for a guy like Sean Tucker. We know he's probably not physically hurt. There was no reason to believe he was physically hurt. But this is when you get into that gray area. And first and foremost, you're just worried about the kid. You're physically just worried about the young man. This is a little bit kind of similar to, what new Browns defensive tackle Maurice Hurst went through. And granted, Hurst was, figured to be, a top 15, top 20 prospect. That's not Sean Tucker. But, Sean Tucker out of Syracuse, the tape is electric. He can do many things. He's built. He's compact. He comes from a track background. He can contribute as a receiver. I think he's a guy that, easily is could be, an Austin Eckler workload type of back, where you see 15 to 20 touches. It could be, 5, 6, 7 receptions some weeks. Some weeks it could be 12, 13, 14 carries. But these are guys that could come in here. And I'm not discounting Jerome Ford, but the problem is, and Pete, and we've always talked about this, and your favorite line is, if I haven't seen it, I can't take it as fact. And that's the problem with Jerome Ford right now. We might think the talent is there. And look, his preseason was good. I think you can take some of what he did as a kick returner and say, that seems like it's translatable as far as, playing from the running back position. But this might be the year to get that room, a lot cheaper, a lot younger, and maybe start to show some signs of life of, what, if it ever came to it, and if it has to come to it, that nobody wants it to come to it, what a running back room for the Browns could look like after Nick Chubb.
Yeah, I think, again, 8 carries for Jerome Ford, but I like Jerome Ford. I like what, he's the one guy, the one running back that has been added to this team that was post Deshaun Watson with a real asset. Like, they actually said, Deshaun Watson's on our football team. We want Jerome Ford. So I'm good with that. But my thing is, if Jerome Ford is good and you get 2 more running backs that are good, more good is more good. Like, the better you are, the more threat you are. And ultimately, whenever the Browns, have to move on from Nick Chubb, it may take 3 guys to replace him.
No doubt.
And that may be what life is like until you stumble on another star. You're going to have to keep taking swings. And that's the other part about this. Whenever Nick Chubb goes, you have to keep taking hacks at the plate to find a dude who can replace that. And it may take more than one. So if it's 2, if it was 1 last year, it's 2 this year. It may be another one next year. Get enough guys to make sure that's not a problem. Don't end up like the Houston Texans during the Houston Texans at part of Deshaun Watson's career. Make sure that is a big part of what you do and continue to force opponents to respect both parts. I like your guy, Sean Tucker. Great zone runner. I'm weirded out by the fact that people say he's not a good receiver when I see him make guys miss, get open, catch the ball with his hands, and then, score. But that's the thing. So much of this is about style and what you like and who you're into. Like Roschon Johnson of Texas is a lot of fun to me. There's just nothing there because they had Bijan Robinson there. And so it's like, is he Pepe Pearson behind Eddie George, or is he going to be more like Frank Gore, where, the depth chart and then many knee injuries in that scenario sort of kept him on the bench. But is he a guy who's a former quarterback, who's really, really smart, who can do a lot of fun, interesting, versatile things where you go, I love this. And he's a power back. Like, first and foremost, he's going downhill and he's going to pound it between the tackles and give you a lot of those things. So, like, that's why I say they are so spoiled for choices here. And it doesn't mean they have to draft 2. The other option is you draft 1 and then you pick up an undrafted free agent. I like the kid out of Marshall. You know who didn't like the kid out of Marshall? Notre Dame. Notre Dame wanted no part of that kid. They were kept ankle grabbing and trying to nip at him, and he just ran over. Was it LeBourne or something? Kalen LeBourne or something?
Yep.
He's a grown man, in part because he's old. He's like 20. I think he's on the verge of 24 because he was out of football a couple of years. Of course, he went to, I think, Florida State is where he started.
And I was hoping you were going to get to that.
But like, throw on that tape against Marshall, who beat Notre Dame, and watch what that young man does. Even when he's blocking, he just runs angry. So there's other guys in this class. There's a kid from Youngstown State just down the road that's going to could potentially be an undrafted free agent. So if you draft one and that's where you get your other guy, fine. I just think somehow, some way, you're going to want to get 2 out of this whole class.
We've gotten to a bunch here today. The Browns running back room and what exactly the plan is after Nick Chubb. Are there any viable options in free agency? And of course, this week we switched it up a little bit for Mock Draft Monday. I've been talking about running backs for months now. So we just try to basically devote this episode. And so we took the Mock Draft Monday that way for you. He is Pete Smith, Browns Digest, SportsIllustrated.com. Check out all the work over there. Him and his team are doing a fantastic job. Also, Browns Bites, the podcast weekly. Pete and Bree break it down. They do a fantastic job. Could not recommend it enough. Make sure you're following @_Pete Smith _ myself, Jeff Lloyd, @Jeff_LJ_ Lloyd. The show @Locked On Browns. Follow back account. DMs are open, as everybody knows. G. Bush out for today. We'll see how long. It might be something where he's out more than a show or 2. Hopefully, rebound. We'll see the way that all works out. For all your Browns content, make sure you are subscribed to the Locked On Browns YouTube channel. Notifications on, so when the content drops, you guys are there to absorb it. Available on all podcast platforms, of course. Always available, always free. This has been your daily delivery of all things Dogbound. LGB on ELOB. Let's go, Browns.